Last week, I shared some of the story of Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian scientist and writer born in 1769, who changed the world by changing the way science understands the complex relationships of the natural world. He was the first to isolate climate zones across the globe. He was also the first person to observe and articulate the ways in which humanity was changing regional climates, and how our activities would ultimately change the global climate, making the planet uninhabitable eventually for humans and perhaps other animal species. As he traveled through the Americas and Asia, observing and noting everything, he recognized that governments which make a practice of exploiting land always exploit people. He foresaw that racism and enslavement would be the undoing of the new democracy called the United States. He influenced many great thinkers of his time and later, thinkers like Charles Darwin, Henry David Thoreau, and John Muir, who built on his work to create their own influential legacies. When Alexander von Humboldt died in 1859 at the age of 89, he was arguably the most famous man on earth. His books had been translated into 36 languages and had sold hundreds of millions of copies. He had more places named after him than anyone else before or since. Cities, counties, parks, rivers, lakes, and mountains. He also had a few animal and plant species named after him. Throughout his 80s, he was so loved he received more than 5,000 letters a year from admirers and worked around the clock to answer every one of them, on top of finishing his series of books called Cosmos. It's said that his final words were, "How glorious these sunbeams are. They seem to call Earth to the heavens." Millions gathered around the world in the places named after him to mourn. On the 100th anniversary of his birth, the world celebrated with massive festivities in New York, Berlin, Mexico City, Adelaide, and countless other cities, including Cleveland. So if he was so famous and so influential then, why is he not remembered now? A tiny part of me wants to say he's forgotten because he was gay. He was unmarried his whole life, even though he was pursued by wealthy and beautiful women. Yet he wrote amazing love letters to a few men in his life, dedicating himself to them, professing his desire to be with them. He even wrote about sharing beds with his special gentleman friends in his published personal reflections and travel logs. He would be emotionally shattered for months whenever a relationship ended. Andrea Wolf's biography of Humboldt is a bit of a hagiography. It reads like one of those Lives of the Saints books, the picture of a perfect superhuman except for one detail. Humboldt was the stereotypical imperious old queen. His whole life, he would charm people to their faces and gutter snipe behind their backs. He died bitter and lonely, in love with the natural world, but not so much with people. But Humboldt's life wasn't a classic tale of marginalized homosexual in a world that refused to see him. Wolf contends that the primary reason he was forgotten was because he was German. With the dawn of the First World War came a wave of anti-German sentiment across the globe. The royal family of England changed their name from the very German-sounding Saxe-Coburg to the very English Windsor. Frankfurters became hot dogs, and here in Cleveland, where thousands had marched to mark Humboldt's centennial, German books were burned in a huge bonfire. The irony is that Humboldt couldn't stand Germany. He always preferred France. where he spent most of his adult life. But perhaps the biggest reason Humboldt faded into obscurity is because of the nature of his work. He wasn't known for one big discovery. He was known more for his worldview that came from an aha moment near the top of a mountain in South America. A worldview that was misunderstood and even mocked by many in his time. It was, and still is, difficult for many to comprehend or accept. We still have climate change deniers. He was quoted so many times by so many writers that his ideas became their ideas, the foundations on which they built their work. There's an old adage that the first 3 times you quote someone, you give them credit. After that, you can use it freely. The truth is that the concepts Humboldt put forth about the interconnectivity of life became mainstream among scientists. And after a generation or two, so foundational to scientific work that only historians cared about Humboldt's impact. In a way, the people Humboldt mentored and influenced became more famous over the long haul than the man himself. Even though Humboldt taught Thoreau how to be a poet and a scientist simultaneously, the only place Thoreau ever mentioned his spiritual mentor was in the pages of his journals, which were never published until after his death. But Thoreau influenced others who, knowingly or not, built on the work of Humboldt.
Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I taste your tears. Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I taste your tears. On the dusty earth drum beats the falling rain. Now a whispered murmur, now a louder strain. Slender silvery drumsticks on an ancient drum. Beat the mellow music, bidding life to come. Chords of life awaken, notes of greening spring. Rise and fall triumphant over everything. Slender silvery drumsticks beat a long tattoo. God the great musician, calling life anew.
Morning breeze, spirit song, sing to me at the break of dawn. Sing to me at the break of dawn. With the heart to love at the break of dawn. With the heart of love as we can see. With the heart beating just at the break of dawn. All the world awakens me.
Ancient Ancient Mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient Mother, I taste your tears.
With the heartbeat of the sea.
The reading today is from Outermost House, A Year of Life on the Great Beach of Cape Cod by Henry Beston. I have been spending my afternoons gathering driftwood and observing birds. The skies being clear, noonday suns take something of the bite out of the wind, and now and then a warmish west-southwesterly finds its way back into the world. Into the bright, vast days I go, shouldering home my sticks and broken boards and driving shorebirds on ahead of me. Putting up sanderlings and sandpipers, ringnecks and knots, plovers and killdeer, coveys of a dozen, little flocks, great flocks, compact assemblies with a regimental air. For a fortnight past, an enormous population of the migrants has been stopping over on my Eastham sands, gathering, resting, feeding, and commingling. They come, they go, they melt away, they gather again. For actual miles, the intricate and inter-crisscross pattern of their feet runs unbroken along the tide rim of Cape Cod. Yet it is no confused and careless horde through which I go, but an army. Some spirit of discipline and unity has passed over these countless little brains, waking in each flock a conscious sense of its collective self and giving each bird a sense of himself as a member of some migrant company. Lone flyers are rare, and when seen have an air of being in pursuit of some flock which has overlooked them and gone on. Swift as the wind they fly, speeding along the breakers with the directness of a runner down a course, and I fear in their speed. Sometimes I see them find their own and settle down beside them half a mile ahead. Sometimes they melt away into a vista of surf and sky, still speeding on, still seeking. We need another and wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly err. For the animals shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth.
Henry Beston Sheehan was a poet. He wasn't the most successful poet who ever published in the early part of the 20th century, but he came from good stock in Quincy, Massachusetts, home of the father and son Adamses, the second and sixth presidents of the United States. He went to Adams Academy, then Harvard, before teaching at the University of Lyon in France. Like Humboldt, he preferred French culture. So when he returned to the United States after World War I, he dropped his father's last name to be known simply as Henry Beston. Beston was his mother's French maiden name. While working as an editor for the Atlantic Monthly, he visited Cape Cod frequently. He also met his future wife, Elizabeth, who wouldn't marry him until he published his own book. He bought a piece of land on the dunes of Nauset Marsh in the town of Eastham and had built a small but sturdy 2-room house on stilts with a fireplace and a porch. It was just feet from the Atlantic Ocean and the outermost part of Cape Cod. He called the house Forecastle and planned to stay there just a few weeks at a time. But when he arrived at the end of summer in 1927, he found he couldn't leave. He stayed for a year, observing, journaling, and writing Outermost House, the book that would make him famous and win his bride. Beston was influenced by Thoreau and indirectly by Humboldt. Humboldt was a scientist whose writing was a tool of communicating his observations. Thoreau was an artist who used scientific tools of observation to gain deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. Beston never claimed to be a scientist, just a poet, observing the world to create art that would elevate the relationship between humans and nature. He's said to have labored over each word of the book's prose with the care of a poet. And he paid the same kind of attention to the life outside of his door. In Outermost House, he wrote of the essential elements, earth, air, and sea, meeting at the dunes. He wrote of the passing of time and the seasons with the same attention that Humboldt and Thoreau gave everything. He wrote about the Coast Guard men who were his only human contacts during the long, solitary winter. Beston rarely wrote of himself or his thoughts about his own essential being, which made him very different from the transcendentalists Thoreau identified with. What he wrote about most frequently, and this is what set him apart in the late 1920s, was an idea that came to him as he had the opportunity to observe animals up close. We shouldn't think of animals as our inferiors or even our siblings, but rather as nations of their own. He never referred to animals or geographic features as it. He always said he, she, or they, not to anthropomorphize them, but to recognize their autonomy. His observation of starlings seemed, to me at least, to be his epiphany, his aha moment that changed forever his way of thinking. In Europe, starlings congregate in enormous flocks, numbering sometimes in the hundreds of thousands, moving like a great living black cloud with a mind. One mind. The communication between them is so finely tuned. But they aren't native to North America. They came here on ships. Beston wrote, "Are the flocks at Eastham the beginning of one of those European mobs? Will the various flocks now inhabiting the moors ultimately mingle to form one enormous and tyrannous confederacy? Such a mingling may possibly take place. Again, it may be that the resources of the region are already taxed to support the present birds. Let us hope that this last is the truth. The presence of these rabble blackbirds disturbs the entire natural economy of the region, for they strip every autumnal bush and plant bare of its last seed and berry and leave nothing for our native birds to feed on when they return in the spring. More than any other flocks of birds, The starlings moved together like dancers in choreographed motion, communicating on a level that humans can't even begin to imagine, seeming to never have any kind of internal struggle or resistance to external forces. Watching birds, especially starlings, Beston learned that they weren't just cogs in some Cartesian clockwork, each just doing their part out of instinct. They were communicating at a very deep level. They were an army to him, nations unto their own, forming what I would describe as communities of mutual care, dedicated to a mission greater than any individual. A mission that provides for the needs of every individual willing to commit and communicate. I feel like right now, we, humans that is, are at a turning point. We're like those starlings. We've spread ourselves across the globe, separating ourselves from our flocks and forming new ones. Some of us have wandered off individually and have gotten lost, perhaps seeking our flock, perhaps not. In this turning point, we have the power to work together, to fly as a unified nation in a community of mutual care. We know that. We've seen it in the past, especially when we've unified to fight a common enemy. That's when we in this nation have been most able to support a common cause. COVID-19, this novel coronavirus that has changed the world, possibly forever, is an enemy that is forcing us into a turning point that is more urgent than the threat of climate change. It's like a wildfire that's more out of control every day, its own destructive life force growing in ways we can't control any more than we can control the starlings in flight. In his book, The 8 Master Lessons of Nature, naturalist Gary Ferguson talks about wildfires as nature's way of cleansing and starting over, and how they've affected humanity. While the birds and other animals work to escape and save each other, wildfires are one of the greatest disturbances to human lives, at least in half of this country, and one that we have foolishly, for a century now, tried to control and even prevent. The more we control them, the bigger they get, to the point where they're so huge, so destructive that they sterilize the soil, removing all life from the soil instead of nurturing a different kind of life. But, Ferguson writes, disruptions can lead to healing. They can be what allows us to finally leave a toxic job or understand the true cost of staying in an unhealthy relationship. But what about more serious, more catastrophic disruptions? These are the equivalent of the biggest wildfires, cusp events that greatly knock back the forest but stop just short of sterilizing the soil. They're the events in our lives that call most deeply for careful tending of the single blades of grass and sprigs of wild flowers that mark the opening acts of nature's return. Now, I'm not saying that we should just let COVID-19 run its course like some flu, killing off the weakest of us in a twisted plot of social Darwinism that allows the survivors to flourish. What I am saying is that we've had centuries now of scientists, observers, and artists, from Alexander von Humboldt to Henry David Thoreau, from Henry Beston to Gary Ferguson, all building on one basic worldview. We are all deeply connected to each other, to the earth, sea, and air, and everything that forms and lives in them. The corollaries to this premise are simple. Everything we do has consequences that extend through space and time. When we exploit the land, we exploit each other. And we have a lot to learn from the animals and the planet itself in all its elements. This is a moment when we can either work together as communities of mutual care, dedicated to a mission greater than any individual, providing for the needs of every individual. Or we can pretend that we humans are the masters of everything, able to control it all, sacrificing the most vulnerable among us as collateral damage. I know which way I'd like to see this go. I'd like this to be our aha moment on the mountain, the epiphany of the starlings that makes us finally see that we have something to learn. And that if we can make it through the struggles without destroying each other, we'll come out healthier. And so will the planet. May it be so. If there's one thing in Ohio that's at a turning point right now, it's reproductive rights. The state legislature seems determined to make it impossible for women to have access not only to safe and legal abortions, but basic medical care for their reproductive systems and their whole bodies. So this month, we're asking you to make a donation to family planning in Northeast Ohio. Decades ago, our congregation was a founding partner of this organization dedicated to reproductive health and rights of women to have equal access to health care. Once a year, we support them through a special collection. Please send any contributions to the church in the form of a check with loose offering written in the memo line. We're working on an alternative payment method for future months. This contribution is a 50-50 split with the church. Thank you for supporting the work of this congregation in partnership with other organizations. And thank you for being here with us today.
Today's benediction is The Melody of Life by Joseph Cleveland. May we hear the melody of life and find ourselves singing harmony. May we be open to the dissonances in the song of the land and its people that we might be part of the world's urging toward justice, peace, and love. May we feel in our bones the rhythms of life and the land, and find ourselves dancing.
We join hands in Unitarian Universalist fellowship, pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom which transcends all creeds, not to think alike, but to journey together.